The last thing Sergeant Cale Dross remembered before the signal cut was the sound of his own voice telling his unit to stand down. He remembered it the way you remember a dream you've tried to hold. The details already softening at the edges, already becoming something the Conclave's broadcast engineers could reshape into whatever story served the ratings. He remembered the square at Veth Koron, the crowd of civilians pressed against the ration barriers, their hands empty, their mouths open. He remembered the order coming through the command channel. Not from his commanders, but from the Vorth Directorate itself. Transmitted through the skull mesh, every soldier wore. A voice like grinding ore telling him to clear the square. He remembered refusing. He remembered the unit firing anyway. And he remembered waking up in a processing cell with dried blood on his uniform that wasn't his, and a charge sheet listing 43 civilian deaths. His name, his fingerprints on the trigger of something he never pulled. That was 8 months ago. Now he stood in a white corridor that smelled of antiseptic and scorched polymer, wearing a numbered tag around his neck, listening to a Vorath adjudicator, read the terms of his participation in something called the Pursuit. The adjudicator was tall. They were always tall. The Vorath favored height the way humans favored symmetry, building their bodies to architectural specification. This one had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band across its face, each lens a slightly different amber shade, and it read from a translucent tablet in a tone that managed to be simultaneously ceremonial and bored. Contestant 371, Cale Dross, convicted under Directive 14 of willful dereliction leading to civilian casualties. Sentence: participation in the pursuit, standard duration, standard terms. Should you survive the duration of the broadcast cycle without elimination, your sentence will be considered discharged. It set the tablet down. You will not survive. Dross looked at it for a long moment. He had a face that had taken a few hits over the years. A nose broken twice, a scar along the jaw from a piece of shrapnel that had come an inch from ending his career at 22. And he wore it all without self-consciousness, the way old furniture wears its dents. You said that like you've done it a few times, he said. 412 times, the adjudicator said. In 11 seasons. Anyone ever make it? The adjudicator blinked. All 4 lenses at slightly different speeds, which Dross had learned was the Vorath equivalent of a smile. The broadcast record, it said carefully, shows 3 winners. The actual record? It said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They put him in the chute at 0900 Galactic Standard, which was the primetime slot on 17 inhabited systems. The Pursuit was the Vorath Broadcasting Conclave's most watched program, had been for 6 seasons running, which in Vorath terms meant it had outlasted 3 planetary administrations and 1 minor civil conflict. The format was simple. Human prisoners were inserted into the Pursuit grid, a 50-square-kilometer zone of derelict urban infrastructure on the moon Thresh 9, and hunted by the Conclave's elimination specialists, 7 of them, each with a distinct combat style, each with their own following among the viewership. Dross had watched the show from his cell. Everyone did. The Conclave made sure of it. He understood what it was for. You take the people most likely to cause trouble: veterans, resistance organizers, journalists, anyone whose existence complicated the story the Conclave wanted to tell. And you put them on television and let the audience watch them die. The dying was important. The dying meant they weren't martyrs. They were just losers. He'd watched 3 other human prisoners go in before his processing was complete. 2 lasted less than an hour. One, a woman named Yeva Strand, whose name he'd recognized from the resistance networks, made it almost 4 hours before the specialist called Null Point caught her in the eastern quadrant. The crowd roared. The commentators praised Null Point's restraint. It had apparently allowed her to run for 40 minutes longer than necessary for dramatic effect. Dross had watched that part twice. The chute opened and he dropped into gray morning light, the grid stretching out ahead of him. Broken prefab towers. Collapsed transit bridges, streets that had once carried 10,000 people now carrying only wind and the distant hum of the broadcast drones overhead. He could see them if he looked up, small, dark, patient, their lenses turning toward him like flowers tracking a sun. He did not look up for long. He moved. The first rule of any hostile environment: don't stop moving until you know where the walls are. He'd learned that in basic, learned it again in 3 deployments, learned it a 3rd time in the processing cell. When the guards changed, shifts in the corner by the water recycler was the only place the cameras didn't fully cover. You find the geometry of a space and you live inside it. The space always has geometry, even a game show. He'd spent his 8 months of processing time thinking about the grid. He'd watched the broadcast recordings they piped into the cells. The conclave wanted you to know what was coming, wanted you terrified. And he'd watched them not as a victim but as a tactician. The grid had patterns. The specialists had zones they preferred. The broadcast drones had predictable arcs based on where the action was. The audience liked the southeast quadrant because the lighting from the gas giant Thresh 9 orbited gave everything a dramatic amber cast in the late afternoon. He headed northwest. He was 400 meters into the grid, moving between the shells of what had once been a light manufacturing district. When the broadcast tone sounded, 3 descending chimes, that meant a specialist was being released. The conclave liked to stagger them. The first specialist always came early, while the contestant was still disoriented, still learning the space. It was good television. The one they sent first was called Rimaclaw. Dross knew Rimaclaw from the broadcasts. It was a Vorath specialist who had competed for 4 seasons, famous for operating in enclosed spaces. It had been a tunnel hunter before the conclave recruited it, and it moved through rubble and wreckage the way water moved through cracks, finding the path you didn't expect. Its weapon of choice was a monofilament net launcher that could wrap a target in cutting wire at 30 meters. It was fast. It was methodical. It had never lost a target once it had a scent lock. Dross heard it before he saw it. A rhythmic clicking that the Vorath used for echolocation in enclosed spaces, a sound like a clock mechanism unwinding. He was already climbing. The manufacturing district had a row of prefab towers. Most of them collapsed to 40 or 50% of original height, their upper floors open to the sky. He'd picked the third one, structurally the most intact, which mattered less than the fact that its northeast face had a series of cooling vents that ran vertically from the second floor to the roof. Close enough together to climb like a ladder, if you were willing to put your full weight on polymer brackets not designed for it. He'd identified it from the broadcasts. A contestant named Varro, 11 episodes ago, run past it without looking up. Varro was dead. But the vents were still there. He went up fast, hands and feet, finding the brackets by feel, not looking down, the clicking below him getting louder and then stopping. Rimaclaw had found trail in the dust, was calculating the angle. He heard the net launcher cycle. He was 12 meters up when the first net hit the wall below him, the monofilament hissing as it spread and contracted around nothing. He kept climbing. At the top, he lay flat on the roof edge, breathing through his nose, looking down at the thing below. Rimaclaw stood in the street, its hunting body tilted upward, 4 eyes scanning. It was beautiful in the way that pure function is beautiful. Evolved for exactly this purpose, confident in its own perfection, it began to climb. Dross had expected that. He moved back from the edge, found the maintenance hatch he'd seen in the broadcast footage, got it open. The hinges had corroded, but they weren't welded, and went down through the inside of the building instead. 4 floors of interior darkness, debris on every landing. A stairwell that had partially collapsed but was passable if you went sideways through the gap on the 3rd floor. He came out a service exit on the east side, which put the entire building between him and where Rimaclaw had been climbing. He walked south at a measured pace, not running. Running left a different track in the dust, longer strides, deeper impressions, clear direction. Walking looked like confusion. Walking looked like someone who didn't know where they were going. Rimaclaw came around the south corner of the building 11 minutes later. It found Dross 40 meters away, sitting on a piece of collapsed wall, eating a nutrient block he'd taken from his kit. The specialist stopped. This had not happened before, not in 4 seasons, not in 112 contests. Dross watched it process the anomaly. He was prey that had not run. He was prey that was eating. He held the specialist gaze and took another bite. The net launcher came up. Dross rolled, left the instant he saw the shoulder rotation that preceded the fire. He'd watched Rimaclaw in 17 episodes, knew the tell, and the net spread over the spot where he'd been sitting, monofilament contracting around a chunk of prefab concrete that split cleanly into 3 pieces as the wires bit down. He was already moving, already into the next street, and when he glanced back, he saw Rimaclaw standing very still in the amber morning light, with something that might have been calculation on its face. He led it for 2 hours. That was the part the audience didn't understand yet. He wasn't running from it. He was running it. Every direction he chose was calculated to bring it through terrain that favored him, to tire its particular physiology. Rimaclaw had evolved for short-burst hunting, not sustained pursuit, to waste its ammunition and its certainty. By the time he pulled it into the collapsed transit interchange in the northwest corner, the specialist had fired its net launcher 4 times and was moving more slowly, its echolocation clicks coming at longer intervals. The interchange had a transit car still on its track, wedged at 45 degrees where the track had buckled. Inside the car, Dross had earlier found a length of heavy-gauge cable from a broken signaling system, 10 meters, stiff but workable, with a solid copper hook fitting at one end. He let Rimaclaw see him go into the car. The specialist came in after him. That was the other thing he'd learned from watching. The Vorath had a response to prey that hid. It was not a response suited to traps. They were confident in enclosed spaces. Their confidence was the trap. He came out through the emergency roof hatch as Rimaclaw entered through the rear door, swung the cable once around a fractured support strut, and brought the copper hook down hard on the exposed circuit cluster at the back of Rimaclaw's skull mesh. The Vorath military uplink that every soldier and specialist wore. The same kind Dross himself had worn before they cut his out in processing. The mesh shorted. Rimaclaw went rigid, then fell, its hunting posture collapsing into something that looked almost graceful. It was alive, stunned but alive. The current from its own mesh had cycled back through the hook and the cable and up into Dross's hands, and he'd let go the instant he felt it, and now he stood looking at the thing on the floor of the broken transit car. He could kill it. The conclave expected him to kill it. The audience expected it. 112 contests said the pattern was prey runs, specialist catches, prey dies, crowd cheers. He left it breathing. Above him 3 broadcast drones hovered in tight formation, their lenses wide open. The conclave's commentary booth was a pressurized module suspended above the western grid on an anti-grav platform, and the 2 commentators, a Vorath named Orthvel, and uniquely, a human collaborator named Solus who had survived 2 seasons as a contestant before accepting a broadcast contract, had been talking without pause for 4 hours. The audience numbers, streaming in from 17 systems, had been climbing steadily since the first hour. Contestant 371 is still alive, Orthvel noted, with the particular tone it used when the situation was not following expected parameters. Cale Dross, Solus said. He had learned, in his time at the booth, to always use their names. It was the one small defiance he allowed himself. His name is Cale Dross. He left Rimaclaw alive. He did. No contestant has ever. I know. The screens in the booth showed Dross moving through the northwest grid, the 3 drones tracking him from above. On 17 other screens, the audience reaction was incoming. Viewing figures, emotional response metrics, commentary from the network nodes on each inhabited system. The conclave processed audience data in real time, and what it was processing now was making the director's feed pulse with yellow advisory lights. Dross was not generating the expected emotional response. Contestants generated fear, sympathy, and ultimately satisfaction. The satisfaction of a confirmed outcome. Dross was generating something the metrics struggled to categorize. The system kept returning the same word: anticipation. The director-overseer of the broadcast, a Vorath executive named Chethvar, who had run the pursuit for 6 seasons and had never once had cause to revise his pre-show probability models, was staring at this data with 4 unblinking eyes and a growing sense that the afternoon was not going as planned. Send Colossus, it said. Colossus was the second specialist, 800 kilograms of Vorath combat biology, augmented with powered exoskeletal plating that could shrug off directed energy fire at close range. It had been champion of the pursuit for 2 seasons, beloved by audiences for the theatrical deliberateness of its hunting style. It moved slowly and it moved inevitably, and things in its way did not stay in its way. Dross heard the second broadcast tone and checked his position. He was in the industrial quarter now, a zone of processing plants and storage silos that the pre-show research told him contained, among other things, a Vorath atmospheric processor, a machine that converted Thresh 9's thin native atmosphere into something breathable, in service of whatever population had once occupied this zone. The processor would still be running. The conclave needed breathable air in the grid for the contestants. That meant pressurized lines. That meant venting systems. He spent 40 minutes setting up what he needed. When Colossus found him, it broadcast its own location with sound, a deep rhythmic percussion that was either intimidation or ceremony or both. He was ready. The fight from the audience's perspective lasted 3 minutes. From Dross's perspective, it lasted approximately 1,000 years, most of which was spent very close to things that were trying to kill him. Colossus was everything the broadcasts had shown, and a few things they hadn't, faster than it looked. unexpectedly quiet in the final 3 meters, and possessed of an intelligence that recognized, about 90 seconds in, that Dross was not running but rather positioning. By then it was too late. The atmospheric processor's emergency pressure valve was behind it, and when Dross triggered the manual release he'd wired to a section of conduit he'd found in the storage block. The venting jet hit Colossus at 600 psi and drove it backward through a prefab wall. The powered exoskeleton protected it. The concrete secondary wall it hit 15 meters later did not. Alive, still alive. Dross checked from 30 meters out, confirmed the rise and fall of its chest, and moved on. He's not killing them, Orthvel said. No, Solus agreed. Why? Solus considered this for a moment. On the screens, the audience metrics were no longer pulsing yellow. They were steady green, a color the Conclave system used for peak engagement, the kind that preceded the highest-rated moments in the show's history. Because he knows we're watching, Solus said. He's always known we're watching. Chethfar had been standing behind the commentary booth for the last 30 minutes without speaking, which was unusual. It watched the screens. On screen 12, the defeated Rimiclaw was being extracted from the northwest quadrant by a recovery team. On screen 9, the Colossus retrieval was underway. On the main screen, Dross was moving through the industrial quarter with the unhurried confidence of someone walking to an appointment he'd scheduled himself. The director-overseer understood, in a way that made its executive functions briefly misfire, that it was no longer running this broadcast. He was. It sent the next 3 specialists simultaneously. This had never been done. The format called for sequential release. Suspense required sequencing, required the audience to watch each encounter unfold with full attention before the next began. 3 at once was logistically possible but aesthetically wrong. It was also, Chethfar had concluded, necessary, because the alternative was watching one human being dismantle its entire roster one at a time at a pace entirely of his choosing. Dross heard 3 tones. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of a street that had once been a commercial throughway, empty storefronts on both sides. The amber light of Thresh-9's parent planet painting, everything in warm gold. And he looked up at the drones overhead with an expression that the audience on 17 systems would later describe, in the feedback metrics, as amused. He had 3 hours of daylight left. He had learned the geometry of this place over 8 months of careful watching. He had 3 specialists incoming, and he knew from the broadcasts where each of them preferred to operate. He started moving toward the southeast quadrant. The audience liked the southeast quadrant. The lighting was good there. What followed was not the choreographed gladiatorial spectacle the Conclave had built its ratings on. It was something harder to categorize. 2 hours of what the commentary booth eventually, and somewhat helplessly described as asymmetric engagement, as Dross moved through the grid, not like a man being hunted, but like a man hunting, using the specialists' own patterns against them, their certainty against them, their showmanship against them. The specialist called Vortex, who hunted with a sonic weapon that could shatter bone at 20 meters, came into the acoustically complex canyon of a collapsed freight terminal and found that the same complexity that amplified its weapon also reflected it. It spent 11 minutes in its own sonic field before finding its way out, leaving Dross entirely unmolested. The specialist called Thrace, an ambush hunter who had spent 6 seasons disguising itself against various surface textures, found that Dross never once used a wall or floor that he hadn't first tested with a thrown piece of debris. It lay in perfect camouflage for 40 minutes, waiting for a target that never came close enough to touch. The third, a new specialist the Conclave had been holding in reserve, brought in specifically as a ratings event, a combat organism the commentators called Dyrorath, was faster and more dangerous than anything Dross had faced, and their encounter in the remains of a water treatment facility lasted long enough that the broadcast drones ran their first emergency battery change in 6 seasons. Dyrorath was good. It was genuinely good in a way the others hadn't been, and Dross spent 40 minutes acknowledging that fact by moving at the absolute edge of his capabilities, bleeding from a cut on his forearm, where Dyrorath's primary weapon, a pressurized blade system that extended from its forearm plating, had caught him during the second engagement. He stopped twice in those 40 minutes to breathe, to recalculate, to find the next geometry. The audience numbers peaked during those 40 minutes. The feedback metrics returned, a reading the Conclave's analysis system had to query 3 times before accepting. The audience was not hoping Dyrorath would win. They had been at the start. That was the contract. You watched the specialist win. You felt the cathartic satisfaction of inevitability. You absorbed the lesson that resistance was futile and the Conclave's order was permanent. That was the entire point of the pursuit. Something had changed around hour 3. Somewhere between Rymaclaw left breathing on the floor of a broken transit car and Colossus embedded in a concrete wall. And it had been changing steadily ever since. And now, in hour 7 on 17 inhabited systems, the audience was watching a man bleed from his forearm and breathe and calculate, and they were hoping. Dross killed the lights. The water treatment facility ran on a residual power grid. Not the Conclave's grid, but an older system left over from the moon's inhabited period. Still drawing power from a geothermal tap, the Conclave hadn't bothered to shut down because it powered nothing they valued. Dross had found the main junction box in his first pass through the facility. Now he disconnected it, and the facility dropped into darkness, and Dirarath, whose visual system was calibrated for Thresh-9's ambient light conditions, which it now didn't have, lost him. He put Dirarath down with a length of conduit in the dark. He was careful about it. He checked the pulse in the thing's neck. The Varath had a pulse point low on the throat, below where the armor didn't cover, and found it steady, and left it there. Then he sat down against a wall in the dark and pressed his sleeve against the cut on his arm, and breathed for a while. He was tired. He was genuinely, deeply tired in a way that had nothing to do with the running. He was tired of the geometry of the thing, the constant calculation, the managing of terrain and timing, and his own body's complaints, the relentless awareness that one mistake in a long chain of correct decisions would still end everything. He was tired of being watched. He was tired of performing survival. He thought about Yeva Strand, running through the eastern quadrant for 4 hours because Nullpoint had allowed it. He thought about the 43 civilian deaths attached to his name, the charge sheet he hadn't signed. He thought about the adjudicator saying, "You will not survive," with the particular certainty of someone who had said it 412 times and been right each time. He thought about the processing cell and the guards changing shifts and the corner by the water recycler where the cameras didn't fully cover. And how he'd spent a long time sitting in that corner, not hiding from anything, but just being, briefly, unobserved. He allowed himself 2 minutes of that feeling now. 2 minutes of being a person instead of a data point. Then he got up. The Conclave had a protocol for broadcast situations that deviated from expected parameters. The protocol had never been fully invoked. It existed in contingency documents that Chethvar had read once, 7 years ago, during certification training, and never looked at since. The protocol was called narrative correction. It involved the selective editing of incoming broadcast footage to restore the expected emotional arc of the program. In practice, you faked it. You took your reserve footage. Each specialist had a catalog of past victories, and you cut it in. You told the audience what happened without showing them what happened. You closed the loop. Chethvar had tools for this. Every director overseer did. The problem was Solus. Solus had been in the commentary booth for 4 seasons. He knew the broadcast system in the way that you know any tool you use every day. Its quirks, its shortcuts, its maintenance hatches. He had been a contestant once. He had survived not by fighting the specialist, but by understanding the grid. And the understanding had gotten him a contract, and the contract had gotten him into this booth. And in this booth he had been watching for 4 seasons with the particular attention of someone who knew what was real and what was being made real for the audience. He had contacts in the resistance networks. He had always had contacts in the resistance networks. He had always known this day would come. When Chethvar gave the order for narrative correction, Solus was already in the secondary broadcast node, which he had accessed through the maintenance access he had mapped 6 months ago and never mentioned. And he had already replaced the outgoing feed with something else. What the audience on 17 systems received in the next 7 minutes was not narrative correction. It was the archive. Not the edited broadcast archive, the raw intake archive, the uncut footage that the Conclave kept for its own internal review and never released. 7 seasons of it. 412 contestants. The ones who had been listed as winners, 3 of them. Shown in the raw feed walking into a sealed zone and not walking out. The feed cutting cleanly to black in each case. The production notes alongside them, reading in clear Vorath administrative language, that the winner narrative had been applied and the body was in disposal. The Resistance had been working on the transmission hack for 8 months. They had been waiting for a broadcast cycle that the audience was already paying attention to. Dross emerged from the water treatment facility into amber light. and looked up at the drones and understood from the way they were moving. Erratically, their formation broken, the careful pattern of their tracking disrupted, that something had changed in the booth. He didn't know what. He hadn't known about Solus. He hadn't needed to. He'd only needed to give the audience enough reason to keep watching. He walked toward the facility exit. Above him, the drones steadied into a new formation. Not the broadcast formation they'd held for 7 hours. A different arrangement. Their lenses aimed not at him but at each other. A short-range configuration he recognized from his years in the field. Emergency coordination. Something had changed in their instructions. He walked through the grid's eastern perimeter without being challenged. The sonic deadline, the barrier that activated the explosive leash every contestant wore, was offline. He found that out when he crossed it, and nothing happened. And he stood on the other side of it for a moment, with his hand pressed to his forearm, and the cut bleeding slowly through his sleeve, standing in a space that the pursuit's rules said he could not be standing in. He heard distantly the sounds of the facility that housed the broadcast operation, voices, movement, the particular acoustic signature of a building in which something unexpected was happening. He started walking toward it. The director-overseer Chethvar was still in the booth when the security situation escalated past the point where its own guards could manage it, and it made the decision. The correct administrative decision, the decision that protected the conclave's executive personnel above all other considerations. To evacuate via the emergency transit pod, which was a single-seat atmospheric capsule mounted to the underside of the broadcast platform. It entered the pod. It sealed the pod. It initiated the transit sequence that would carry it to the conclave's secondary facility on Thresh 9's northern pole. The pod launched. Dross, standing on the roof of an adjacent structure with a section of salvaged heavy cable he'd picked up on his way through the industrial quarter, watched it go for about 3 seconds before he threw the cable. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't planned. He'd been aiming to reach the platform itself, not intercept the pod, and the cable caught the pod's rear stabilizer purely because the transit path brought it close enough. But it caught, and the cable's other end was secured around a structural pillar, and the pod got approximately 40 meters into its trajectory before the cable snapped taut, and the pod swung back in a long arc and embedded itself in the superstructure of the broadcast platform, with a sound like the end of something. It was structurally intact. Chethvar was fine, physically, though the diagnostic systems were telling Dross from the pod's exterior panel that it was experiencing significant physiological stress indicators. He looked at the pod. He looked at the panel. He left it there and went inside. The secondary broadcast node was on sub-level 3s, and Solus was still there when Dross found him. A compact man in his 40s with the particular economy of movement that came from spending time in confined spaces under stress, sitting in a chair in front of a board that was still live, still transmitting, still showing the Resistance's archive to 17 systems. They looked at each other. Dross, Solus said. "You're the commentator." Was the commentator. He gestured at the board. "The contract clause for this one's probably pretty clear." "How long has the feed been running?" 11 minutes. The resistance cell tapped the relay another 3 minutes before that. By now it's been rebroadcast on. He checked a secondary screen, 4 independent networks. They can't unring that bell. Dross sat down in the other chair. He was very tired. The cut on his forearm had stopped bleeding, which was good, and his hands had a fine tremor that he recognized as adrenaline processing out of his system, which was also probably good, and was definitely going to stop soon. "The Conclave will come back on this," he said. "Yes. And the Resistance needs about 6 more hours of the archive running on independent relay to make it irreversible. After that, there's no version of narrative correction that works. Too many systems, too many copies." "What do you need from me?" Solus looked at him. The same look he'd given from the commentary booth during Hour 3, when the metrics had started reading a color the system didn't have a category for. 6 hours, he said. "The Conclave will send a security contingent, probably here inside 2 hours. The platform has 6 access points and a fairly robust physical security system that I unfortunately know how to bypass, which means I know how someone who wanted to hold this position could bypass the Conclave's attempt to retake it." He paused. "I've been running this board for 4 seasons. I know every access point, and every camera and every maintenance route." Dross nodded slowly. "You're going to talk me through it." "I am. From here, someone needs to keep the feed running." Dross stood. He rolled his sleeve up and retied the makeshift pressure bandage over the cut on his forearm, pulling it snug with his teeth. He found a piece of pipe near the door that was the right weight and length for a man who'd just spent 7 hours learning how to work with what was available. 6 hours, he said. 6 hours, Solus agreed. Tell me about the first access point. Outside on the broadcast platform's exterior, the pod with Chethvar inside sat embedded in the superstructure, and the director overseer was on its emergency comm, telling the conclave that the situation had developed beyond its ability to personally manage, and that immediate executive support was required. The conclave dispatched a security contingent and began the process of assembling a narrative correction package that would explain what the audience had seen in terms that restored the expected emotional arc. They would keep working on that package for 3 days. The archive ran for 8 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than 6, because Dross turned out to be very good at holding access points. On the 4th hour, a resistance cell that had been watching the feed from a transit hub on the second moon reached the platform's eastern perimeter and added 4 more people to the situation. On the 6th hour, a conclave security team reached the platform's main access and found the access point held by one man with a piece of pipe and an exhaustive knowledge of the facility's camera coverage, and spent 90 minutes discovering that this was not an easily solved problem. At hour 8, the director-overseer Chethvar was extracted from the pod by its own security team, who had to cut through the stabilizer housing to get the door open. It emerged into the amber light of Thresh 9's afternoon, looking significantly less certain than it had looked at Iro 900 Galactic Standard, when it had told a numbered prisoner that he would not survive. At hour 8 and 40 minutes, the feed completed and the resistance cell secured the node, and Solus sent a termination signal, and the broadcast board went dark for the first time in 6 seasons. Dross came back down to sublevel 3 and sat in the chair again. His hands had stopped shaking. The cut on his forearm was itching, which he had always been told meant it was healing. He was very tired. Solus was making something hot on a field unit he'd had in his kit. A dense, nutrient-rich broth that smelled of home in a way that Dross couldn't have articulated. Some combination of herbs that were probably more expensive here on Thresh 9 than anywhere else, because everything was more expensive when you weren't supposed to have it. He handed Dross a container. You knew, Dross said. When you said 6 hours, you knew it would go longer. I thought it might. Why didn't you say that? Solus considered this. Because you'd have asked what happens after, he said. And I didn't want to get into all of that before the 6 hours were done. Dross looked at the dark board. Outside distantly he could hear voices. The resistance cell, the security team, whatever combination of outcomes was sorting itself out on the platform above them. He drank the broth. It was good. It tasted like something that had been made carefully by someone who knew it would be needed. What happens after? He asked. Solus sat down. 17 systems saw the archive. 4 independent networks have copies. The Conclave can issue narrative correction for all of it, but they're going to be issuing it to an audience that already has a category for what they saw, that already has a word for it. He paused. The word is true, that's not a plan. No, Solus agreed. It's a start. He looked at Dross with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for a specific moment and was not entirely sure what came after it. The Resistance has been trying for 8 years to crack the Conclave's credibility. You just did it in 1 broadcast cycle. That means something. The question is what you want it to mean. Dross finished the broth. He set the container down. He thought about the adjudicator, reading from its tablet in the white corridor that smelled of antiseptic, 4 eyes blinking at different speeds, telling him with total confidence that he would not survive. He thought about Yeva Strand, whose name he'd recognized, who had run for 4 hours. He thought about 342 people on a charge sheet with his name on it. I want it to mean that nobody goes in the grid again, he said. Solus looked at him for a moment. That's a larger problem than 1 broadcast. Yes, Dross said. He picked up the piece of pipe he'd set against the wall and looked at it. Still good. Still the right weight. Good thing I'm not done running. Outside, in the amber light of a moon that had once been home to 10,000 people and was now the most watched location in 17 systems, the broadcast platform was quiet for the first time in 6 seasons. The drones had landed. The cameras were dark. The audience on 17 systems was sitting with what they'd seen, and the Conclave was beginning the long, difficult work of explaining it. And somewhere in the data streams that connected those 17 systems, the explanation was already finding its limits. Dross walked out into the light. He was not running. He hadn't been running. Not really, not since the first 10 minutes, when the geometry of the place was still unfamiliar. He had been walking, deliberately, at a pace he chose, toward a sequence of problems he was going to solve in order. This was the next one. He rolled down his sleeve, checked the knot on the bandage, and started toward the perimeter. Above him the sky was amber and wide, and for the first time in 8 months, no cameras were tracking his face.